And now it's time for Fireside ChatGPTz.
Did you know that generative AI is deliberately designed to flatter you and make you think all of your ideas are gold? Welcome to another episode of Fireside ChatGPTz. I am your host, Leif Erickson. I'm glad you're here. Now, as we all know, the advent and spread of generative AI presents us with many challenges and problems, and we'll be covering some or all of those in this series. But, of course, we humans are problem-solving creatures, and as educators, we really don't have the luxury of banning or rejecting AI. Our students are using it in growing numbers, and they will certainly be expected to interact with it in the work world, even as it changes and evolves. Educators should take the lead, including making our students aware of those problems and perhaps even working with them to solve problematic AI issues in as much as possible, or at least contribute to the voices and work, learning and growing as thinkers in the process. One way I like to do that is a fun sort of trick I like to do, which I consider a kind of useful rebellion, using AI's flaws to your advantage. For instance, take the flattery flaw. Now, the makers of generative AI, especially LLMs, they designed their robots so that you will return over and over and stay on as long as possible when you do. One way to do that is to flatter you, to make you feel that every idea you have is the best thing that's ever been said. It will even tell you things like, "That's gold!" It's even parodied a lot because it does this so much. Now, it is best to learn to recognize that flattery tendency and to factor it in when interacting with the tech. You can even tell it not to flatter you, and it will maybe listen for a while, but it always seems to want to snap back to sycophant mode. So I try to teach my students not only to be aware of that, but also to apply critical thinking to it. For one thing, not everyone who flatters you has your best interests at heart, which is always a good thing to keep in mind. Awareness is the first step and a crucial one, but I prefer to dig deeper, to demand more than just protecting myself from a technical quirk. That's why I came up with a way to flip it, to use AI's flattery tendency to work your way up to some deep critical thinking and collaboration. I call it the Flattery Flip. To explain, I'll use myself as an example. I'm a writer, and even though I love writing, sometimes it can be very discouraging. And a lot of us with a passion for writing and other arts suffer from good old imposter syndrome, which can come a-knocking at any stage of the writing process. Now, for you, maybe it's something else that triggers those anxieties. But whatever you're working on, when that voice haunts you and you need to climb out of a hole of self-doubt and mental fatigue, you can tap into AI's flattery tendencies and let it glow you up temporarily. Now, like me, I know a lot of my students could use a psychological boost sometimes. They feel like they're not cut out for the task, or that their ideas will be attacked or shredded. This is an effective way to counter negative inner voices, because there is something about humans that really responds to flattery. Of course, we know better than to permanently believe the flattery, and I make sure to stress this to my students and why. But even knowing it is flattery, it is still pretty effective. So we use this human susceptibility for temporary inspiration and motivation. It's like asking a friend to pump you up before you ask someone out or go on stage. At that moment, you don't need brutal honesty and cold reality. There are other times for that. You need a boost. Of course, if the trick ended there, it would ultimately be pretty empty and even counterproductive. You don't want to stay there. You still have to do the work, not just feel good about it. And that's where step 2 of the Flattery Flip comes in. Ask the bot to tell you some specific good thing or things about your work instead of just saying it's gold. This scaffolds you from a temporary psychological boost into the beginnings of productive work in more ways than one. You see, another problem with AI is its tendency to be vague. This is partly because that's an easy way to communicate with a person it knows nothing about. It starts with generics and specifics. Also, it's much easier to flatter someone with vagaries and generalities, so the lack of specificity is also part of the plan to keep you coming back. Push back against that by telling it to be specific. For example, you said my argument was effective and convincing. Tell me something specific that is effective or convincing about it. This does several things. First, it's good practice for recognizing vagueness and generalities, which is a valuable skill to have in terms of critical thinking ability. Next, it trains you to recognize vague writing in your own drafts. Vague and generic writing is ineffective and empty writing. Finally, it forces the bot to identify particular specific strengths you can build on, which you can then take and run with. And even if it ultimately can't identify anything specific that works, that too is valuable because you know now that you have work to do. Now, once you've allowed yourself to be flattered temporarily, and after you've pushed the bot to concretize a piece of faint praise, you can take that nugget of clarity and confidence and use the momentum to dig for ways you might improve your work. Now, perhaps you could tell it to analyze your work like a hypercritical expert. Remove all flattery and praise. Pick this apart like a stern writing professor. Rake this over the coals like a grumpy supervisor. And just like before, if it tries to be vague or general, demand specifics and examples. Now don't worry, if it gets too harsh or counterproductive, you can always adjust or walk away and come back later. The idea is to take AI's tendency to manipulate and turn it to your benefit as a deliberate, active user of the technology. Thank you for tuning in to another edition of Fireside ChatGPTz. I'm your host, Leif Erickson. Have a great day.